Hello, and welcome once again to another edition of Skywatch TV. I'm Gary Stearman, and with me is author and publisher Tom Horn. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Gary. Great to be here.
Oh, it's always great to be with you. We've spent a lot of hours talking before the TV cameras, and I think we've accomplished a lot in the past because you've introduced some concepts, some books that have become bestsellers, and let's talk for a minute about Skywatch TV, your involvement in it, your plans for it. What do you plan to see coming out of Skywatch TV?
Well, I think we'll keep doing what we have done. As you know, Gary, the Lord seemed to have given us kind of a distinct type ministry. We kind of do what nobody else out there does. You know, I pastored for 25 years. You're a pastor too, so you know that was the kind of a job that might have driven me towards retirement, right?
Yes.
And that's really what I was planning to do. I had retired. I had served as an executive in a large evangelical institution, and I had done well enough financially for a while that I thought, I'm just going to move to Missouri and get on a little farm and have some animals and c'est la vie, to the world. But the Lord wouldn't let me do that. But I always had some interests. Some things that I was curious about when I was a pastor. Now I'm talking about things like supernaturalism. Are there angels and demons really? What are aliens? Is that just another version of demons? Is that something else? Is it all just, fictional stories, things that people make up, and all kinds of other things? Atlantis, was there any such thing? Astrobiology. So what I decided to do in my retirement was to start this little newsletter that then turned into a website that then eventually became known as Raiders News Update. And if people go to RaidersNewsUpdate.com on any given day, they'll see that we're still doing that same thing. We kind of ask the questions that other people are not asking. But what's important, Gary, is that we keep all of this in a real strict biblical worldview. That at the end of the day, we're fishing for men.
Yes.
Anything from New Agers to just curious young Christians that may not be getting answers in their local church.
Yeah.
And we're trying to find answers, but keep it in good biblical orthodoxy.
What I hear you saying, Tom, is that you want to investigate some new subjects, but you want to stay in the realm of traditional gospel teaching, the idea that the Word of God is divinely inspired and perfect in its original autographs, the whole idea of the deity of the Lord Jesus Christ. In other words, the classic theological base, but moving out and exploring new subjects. And this is becoming really a kind of a hot topic in Christianity. I think of you as being on the cutting edge of it. There are subjects now that we as, I suppose, theologians, as those who are commissioned, if you will, to set forth the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, there are topics, just because of the changes in society, that we have to begin to address. And you've started to address some of them in your latest books. And I might add, you've borne a little criticism. People have accused you of straying too far from the gospel. And let's talk about that issue. Let's talk about what has changed in society, in science, in the government, in the direction of spirituality. A lot has changed, right?
Absolutely. And again, I would suppose if somebody were to look at me, I've never had nobody say I've strayed from the gospel in the sense that I preach a different gospel.
Yeah.
But have I strayed from what I used to preach when I was a pastor? Well, sure I have. I'm in a completely different environment, in a different situation. I do television, I write books. If I were a pastor, then I would, by constraint of that responsibility, of course, I'd marry people and bury people, and I'd talk about how you live through today and have faith, and I'd talk about finances, and I'd talk about all the basic kind of getting by in life, right? How to have faith in a kind of a sometimes cruel world. But I have the benefit in the position that I'm in now to launch something like this new mothership called Skywatch Television, in which we're going to have the opportunity to actually address some of the strange and the bizarre, but our theology will still be straight up Western evangelical theology. We still believe in the virgin birth of Christ. We believe in his ascension, his death, burial, and resurrection. We believe that only in him. This is something that a lot of the modern denominations are doubting now.
That's right.
Maybe we can get to God in all kinds of ways. No, we still believe there's only one way under heaven whereby men can be saved, and that's in Christ Jesus the Lord. So our theology is old-fashioned, if you will, but our willingness to talk about subject matter that other people might not touch with a 10-foot pole, that's what sets us apart. For instance, you know, this last year, and again here in more recent days, people are hearing strange noises all over the world.
Yes.
And even scientists and some of the, you know, like the Army Corps of Engineers are scratching their head. They're trying to figure out, what is this hum, or what is this sound? Almost sounds like trumpets underground.
Yeah.
Some of it sounds like the clanking of metal. And when I've read some of the descriptions, even on secular websites, I've sat back and a couple times the hairs just kind of stood up on the back of my neck, because I've thought, are these the angels, both fallen and unfallen, warming up for a battle that was described in the book of Revelation? Is that it? Well, maybe I have an overreaching imagination, right? But still, it's a contemporary issue. And if I'm asking those questions as an old guy that's been around for a long time, I imagine young people in churches are asking the same questions. And here's really what I want Skywatch Television to do. I want it to stand in the gap, because if the church, at least in some setting, this being one of them, if the church is not answering people's questions, then they go outside of the church. Sometimes they're winding up in really dark places on the internet, and because somebody in a new age or some other even occultic blog or website is talking about the subject that they went to Google about, because they're not getting answers from the church, and they wind up in places where we don't want them to be. So what I would say is, pastors ought to pastor, university theologians ought to be teaching theology, but what we do at Raiders News Update and Skywatch Television is we go where no man has gone before.
Indeed.
And we provide answers to those other questions that people might be asking.
Always fun talking with Tom Horn of Raiders News Network and other enterprises. He is an author. He's written books like Exo Vaticana, Zenith 2016. And here I want to talk about some subjects that maybe people are uneasy about. Let's talk about some black projects in the government. You write about DARPA all the time. What is DARPA?
DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the acronym DARPA. And it's one of the major, probably one of the most well-known, actually, agencies in the government that dole out taxpayer-funded revenue for specific kinds of projects. People might see right now where Google, for instance, has driverless cars, drone cars, robotic cars, and they're driving around all by themselves, right? People have seen them all throughout the United States. But that began some years ago with DARPA issuing a challenge for who the first companies might be that could create a car that would drive without a pilot and win a race through the Mexican-American outback. And the first year, none of the cars hardly made it off the starting line. By the second or third year, half the cars had made it to the finish line, and some of them at fantastic speeds, piloting themselves. Well, that was one of their accomplishments. Now, however, what a lot of people don't know is that DARPA also has an interest in things like super soldier technology. They have an interest in genetic modification. The last 3 budgets, the presidentially approved DARPA budgets in a row, including this year, have literally millions of dollars in there set aside for rewriting the human genetic blueprint. They intend to change the genetic code of soldiers on future battlefields. Now, some might say, why in the world would anybody want to do that? Well, part of it is pharmaceutical. Part of it is to try to cure disease. Part of it is to help soldiers that have been hurt in battle to be able to come back, like regrow an arm that might have got blasted off by some bomb or something in some, some unit overseas. So part of it is that. But part of it is also information that our Pentagon, that our Department of Defense and DARPA are receiving from some of the leading think tanks in the world. For instance, the Jasons. Most people have probably never even heard of the Jasons. If they go to Wikipedia or somewhere and type it in, they'll find out that that's one of the leading think tanks that offer advisory information to our intelligence agencies here in the United States, especially those that are involved in the military. And these are leading scientists. And they come from all fields of science. And guess what? The last 2 or 3 years, report after report from the Jasons to the Department of Defense telling the United States that we have to get ahead in human genetic modification. Otherwise, we are going to fall behind to those who might be our enemies on the battlefield or our competitors in the marketplace.
Well, it's one thing to design a driverless car. It's another thing to retune the human genome. How much tuning will the human genome take before you're no longer human? And that's the question that brings us right into the middle of Bible prophecy.
That's right. Actually, that is exactly why I got involved in that conversation. And it's very strange. We're working on a documentary film right now called Inhuman. The next and final phase of man is here. Well, that sounds sci-fi, doesn't it?
Sure.
And yet, laboratories around the world right now are actually doing cross-species experiments. And the Academy of Medical Sciences out of Britain last year published a 160-page report called ACHM, Animals Containing Human Material. And if a person reads that report, which they can Google and get the PDF online and read it, and the Academy of Medical Sciences for Britain would be compared to like the FDA here in the United States. So it's a major agency that works for the government there. But if you read that report, it'll blow your mind, where they are alleging that there are literally thousands of laboratories around the world that are flying under the radar, that are doing advanced experiments with human and animal integration, literally creating chimeras, right, out of Egyptian history.
Well, I want to read a verse from the Bible, and in the context of what you're saying right now, I want you to comment on Daniel chapter 11, verse 38, and it's speaking about the Antichrist. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold, silver, and precious stones, and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God. Now, here's the Antichrist. He's wielding power, supernatural power, with a strange God. And as we read about him in Revelation, there are strange things about him physically. He has a deadly wound, which is healed. We don't know how it's healed, but we know that when he comes back to life, he's somewhat different than your normal human being. And maybe the Antichrist is the outgrowth of some of these things you're talking about.
Oh, I've thought exactly that, and actually we could go into theories even about the mark of the beast and how the mark of the beast, his system, could be introduced as a result of genetics gone wrong. But Gary, a couple of things I'd like to say about that. One, some people say, scholars have said, that verse can be accurately translated that he will worship an alien God. Mm-hmm. So strange from his fathers in the sense that he is alien, he is unknown, but are we even talking about something in the more kind of contemporary sense?
That takes me right to your book, Exo Vaticana.
Right, Exo Vaticana, and by the way, this is the book, Exo Vaticana, and we wrote this. This is pretty thick book. I wrote it and forgot how many pages it is, but it's like 600 pages, wow, right, in an oversized trim. That was one of the most fantastic investigations that I was ever involved with. And we should tell people that Skywatch Television is going to be different than other prophecy television programming in another way. And that is that several times per year we are going to do special investigative reports where we actually go out into the field and we investigate a phenomenon, and then we come back, and that might be a 3 or 4 week or maybe even longer special broadcast period in which we're doing that kind of work. Well, that's what happened with this book. We became curious about why the Vatican was changing a lot of its terminology around the subject of aliens and why they were going out of their way, having top astronomers for the Vatican out there talking about how they'd like to baptize an alien rite and how we would accept these as our brothers. And we were curious as to why suddenly this tone was kind of coming out of the Vatican. So we set up going to Mount Graham in southeastern Arizona, which is where, on the top of that mountain, that's where the Vatican's Astronomical Technology Telescope, their big advanced telescope, is located. And we set it up so that we could go to the top of that mountain last year, meet with the Jesuits up there that run that for the Vatican. While we were there, there's 2 other telescopes up there that we looked at, a radioscope, and then the large binocular telescope, which is the largest of its kind in the world, but it's inside that facility where they also have what's called the Lucifer device, and that's actually the acronym, the LUCIFER device, which is a device that uses infrared technology so that it can look deeper into space, and most people might understand this, therefore further back into time. And we wanted to know, what were they doing on that mountain? Why that mountain? Why that one in particular? There's a lot in the book about the political arguments and fights and everything it took for them to get up there. Why were they so stuck on that mountain? That remained kind of a mystery to us until we came down off of the mountain and we started talking to the Apache Indian tribe and the other indigenous people that had filed lawsuits to try to keep Rome from going up onto the top of that mountain. We wanted to know why they were against it. Now, our presumption was incorrect. I had thought, for instance, that it's holy ground, right? They were here before us.
Yeah.
Their fathers and mothers had lived there, ate off the mountain, died on the mountain, or buried on the mountain. That wasn't the issue. The issue is that that's considered one of the 4 holiest mountains in the world to numerous indigenous tribes across America. And it is, Gary, guess why? Because they consider that mountain to be a portal, a doorway, a gateway that can open through which things come. As soon as we started learning that, the light kind of went on about, now why in the world would the Vatican, would NASA have such an interest in being on the top of that mountain specifically?
Well, what you're saying here is that spirituality is changing from what it used to be a generation, 2, 3 generations ago. Spirituality at one point in time was really separated sharply between occultism and what is considered to be acceptable belief, Christianity. Even, let's say, liberal Christianity was distinguishable from occultism or the dark side. But now we seem to be, things seem to be merging together into a misty cloud, and you can't tell whether you have stepped into the dark side or whether you're out of it. And to further muddy the waters, science is now tampering with the dark side, including Vatican scientists, and they're all looking for something. They're looking to contact a higher power.
And is that this alien God that Daniel says
exactly
that the Antichrist will worship, this alien God, this God that was not known to our fathers, to our forefathers, something strange. And you know, you mentioned how the Antichrist might even be transhuman in a sense, something that's been genetically altered. And you know, the further we move forward into science, the more we begin to see how, in very real, tangible, and even terrifying ways, much of what the prophets wrote about could come to pass in our day, in our era. Jesus said to his disciples in Matthew 24:37, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it also be at the time of his coming. Well, what was happening in the days of Noah? Above anything else,
Right.
genetic manipulation.
Absolutely.
Altering God's creation. Now, fast forward to 2014, we're going into 2015, and for the first time since the time of the Great Flood, we have set forward to intentionally, genetically alter all of creation. We're doing it with animals, we're doing it with plants, genetically modified foods. We're just a giant experimental bed right now, by the way.
Yes, we
We're
are.
eating genetically modified products, we're contaminating the atmosphere, and we don't really know what the effect on that is, the long-term effect on that is going to be regarding our health. But bringing it back to DARPA and the Pentagon, I mean, they also say we're going to take this to the next level. What we've been doing with genetically modified crops and genetically modified animals, we are going to do with genetically modified humans. And they're saying we're going to do that because we have to. Basically, that's the argument. We must do it because our competitors are doing it, according to these intelligence think tanks, and we cannot let them get ahead of us. The Jasons say we risk falling irreparably, unrecoverably behind in this new arms race. They actually coined the language like an arms race, like in the same way that the old Soviet Union did, and I think the new Soviet Union is poised to do again, enter into this buildup of nuclear arms against the United States for supremacy. Well, the Jasons are saying that's exactly what we are entering into now. They're actually calling it the hybrid age. The new industrial age is the hybrid age. Except instead of building better tank building equipment in factories, we're going to build better humans in factories, and they're going to fight our wars for us.
Which raises the question, where does this fall in Bible prophecy? And are we talking about something that is illegal in the eyes of God, that is tampering with the human genome? If so, we have entered into a sharply defined evil era. A line has to be drawn at some point beyond which you've really stepped into a world from which you cannot return.
I believe that, yeah. I believe that, Gary. I think it's, first of all, it's an insult to God's creative genius. You know, I often tongue-in-cheek say, what did God know about this or that we don't know besides a lot, right?
Yes.
And if God put barriers between the species, which he did, and he ordered that each kind reproduce only after its own kind, and in the book of Leviticus even created laws where if people tried to imitate procreating with an animal, in the Old Testament, they were to be put to death. So there's this very strict code that was placed around creation. And the first record of that being tampered with was fallen angels, dark angels that came down to the earth, tinkered with humanity. These were the watchers that came down in the days of Jared, took wives of all they would, married them. And this blend between fallen angels and humans gave birth to those mighty men of old, the Nephilim, the Gibborim. But look at how that came under judgment. I mean, here you have a God who otherwise is depicted, even in the Old Testament, making provisions for Gentiles to come in and be saved. He's not willing that any should perish. But when it came to the Nephilim and the sin of the watchers, there was absolutely no redemption whatsoever. None. You've talked before about the Raphaim that are described in the Old Testament,
right,
and they're in the underworld. They shall not rise, it says. They will not partake in the resurrection.
That's right.
They cannot be saved. They're eternally doomed.
We're talking to Tom Horn about the future and the direction of Skywatch TV. And Tom's got some visionary ideas about Skywatch. You know, you have laid out a kind of a defense, if you will, of your position. Things are happening that people never could have imagined, say, 20 years ago. For example, the implantation of a microchip in someone's brain to give them an advanced IQ, and some say even a greater spiritual power or prowess. Spiritualizing a human with the implantation of a microchip. That sounds illegal to me.
It does sound illegal in the supernatural sense. We're going to run out of time to talk about much more, but I'll bet you didn't know I had one of those. That's a flexible tattoo. It's one of the newest kinds of technology. If I take that flexible tattoo off of there, I don't know if people can pick that up on their television screen, but if I take one of those out, put it on my hand, tap it to the back of my smartphone, I am authenticated. Now I can enter into government buildings. I pop up on their systems. I'm authenticated. Now that's an early prototype. The ones they're coming out with next year are powered by the heat in your hand. They read the blood vein patterns that are in your hand. So now we're talking about, really sophisticated levels of identification. But where's this technology leading? Well, it's telling us that not only are people going to be genetically modified, a recent poll shows that a very large number of Americans would get a brain implant if it would allow them to be wirelessly connected to the internet. This kind of technology. So many kinds of technologies tell us it's not just going to be genetic modification. We are going to be whole body integrated into a system that even our own government is now calling a living organism, a synthetic mind.
Yeah, well, the famous designer Ray Kurzweil is talking about the nearness of what he calls a singularity, when man and machine will become one. And he says it'll open a spiritual door into knowledge never before seen by man. And he's looking forward to that sort of thing. Well, to me, that is the Antichrist system blossoming right before our very eyes.
I agree with you. Arizona State University this week has a feature article on their front page, and it's all about one thing, the coming singularity and how that's going to change religion. And what they're talking about is how a new form of transhumanist-based religion is growing now. Well, again, that's where we want to step in the gap. We want to stand up and say, no, there's an old-fashioned religion, and it can answer all of the questions that any modern contemporary situation could raise, but it can bring you real religious experience, true conversion, not the geek rapture as they call it about the singularity, right?
Right.
But it can make you one with the living and powerful God. Gary, I don't know how much more time we've got. I know
we have 1 minute.
We got 1 minute. Well, then let me not launch into what my next thought was going to be. Let me just say I'm really looking forward. I want people to know that you are the anchor for the new Skywatch television program. Very much looking forward to doing a lot of specialized programming with you. We will also have other guests that will come in that are experts in their field. And one final thing, we're also working on 2 prophecy conferences, which we hope to host in 2015. Today we were actually looking at one of the facilities where we would bring leaders from around the world in various cutting-edge topics. Of course, I would be there, you would be there. A lot more information coming about that soon.
You've been listening to Tom Horn, and I consider Tom to be a classic defender of the faith in the new world that he's been talking about. It's not your father's or your grandfather's world, spiritually speaking. I'm Gary Stearman for Skywatch Television, along with Tom Horn. Hey, keep watching.
Hi folks, this is Tom Horn coming to you once again from the beautiful Studio A here at the Skywatch television facilities in Missouri. And once again, I've got my good friend Dr. Michael Lake. Welcome to the show again.
It's good to be back, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, on the last program, we both commented after it was over how it felt like we'd only been talking 4 or 5 minutes. We were really just kind of barely scratching the surface. But I want to pick it back up where we were talking about this conspiratorial world view. You know, I read an article not long ago where it said, as it turns out, a lot of the conspiratorists are correct in their view of the world and the machinations of government, agencies and some of the wars that we have fought over time. Turns out that what people laughed at one time and said, oh, you're just a conspiracy nut job, turned out to actually be true. But what you've done in this book, The Shinar Directive, is that you've taken this to a whole new level. You're saying it isn't just some war that the CIA may have been involved with. We're talking about a cosmic level conspiracy that's been playing out since ancient times, and that is directly connected to what Nimrod had done in the land of Shinar, things that actually happened to Nimrod himself, which we'll talk about in a few moments. And these old fellows called the Watchers, these powerful angelic beings that came down to the earth, and as I understand it, among other things, tinkered with the genetic makeup of all life on earth, plants, animals, humans, everything. I mean, we'll get into, why were they doing that. But one of the questions that has bothered theologians since forever, and Bible students wrestle with this all the time. I get emails about it all the time. How were there giants on the earth before the flood, but also after the flood? And we have this new movie came out not long ago on Noah. It's just a ridiculous mess of a movie. It's got the giants helping Noah build the ark and just all kind of crazy ideas. But it hinted that there might have been something on the ark, perhaps one of Ham's wife or something, and the Noah character is thinking he might have to kill her. And it didn't really go into the details, but I know it plays into some of this conspiratorial thought that maybe she was a carrier of the seed, and then maybe some other kind of ideas. But you talk in here, in your book, The Shinar Directive, about one of the possible situations that allowed for knowledge, right? I mean, something was stowed away on the ark.
I was trying to follow the esoteric knowledge. Now, there's several good theories about how there were Nephilim before and after. It could be a reincursion of the Watchers. It could also be that the wives might have had Nephilim DNA encoded within their genetics. But I was trying to follow the knowledge, because there had to be more than just birthing Nephilim to do what they were going to do. And one of your mentors, Dr. Thomas, had wrote about how that there were universities that the Watchers and the Nephilim have founded that predate the flood. And I have kind of wondered, since you follow it, it erupts in the heart of Ham after they get on the other side. I wondered if he didn't take that knowledge with him on the ark, because the devil loves to always have that extra seed, that extra stowaway. And it begins to explode in the heart of Ham. We see that with the sin against his father Noah. And one of the things that I have found, anybody who ever begins getting into esoteric knowledge, one of the first manifestations is this haughtiness, this pride that they have. And that manifests in the heart of Ham, that when Noah gets drunk after partying because of their celebration of their first harvest, instead of covering his father's nakedness, he goes and begins to proclaim it throughout the camp. And that is a symptom of having esoteric knowledge within your soul and the pride that goes with it. And then he began to build through his children the empire that his grandchildren built. Egypt, they built Babylon. It became a family endeavor for them to begin working something other than what God wanted in the earth.
And isn't there also among some of the Jewish apocalyptic literature a suggestion that Ham, perhaps, maybe he found one of those books from that library that Dr. I.D.E. Thomas had talked about in the Omega Conspiracy? I
can't remember if it's the book of Jasher or the book of Jubilees talks about it, and it's either Ham or a son of Noah that's not even listed in the Bible, that they had found the writings of the Watchers and had begun to utilize it. And so the possibility goes either way. What is very obvious is that this family line began to move in esoteric knowledge that God was trying to wipe out with the flood, and begin to reestablish what the Watchers were doing in the earth.
Yeah. Now, by the way, this raises another question. For people that have studied this issue, they come across the Sethite point of view, and then there is what's called the angel theory. Explain those two different worldviews and what the relationship of those views is with the research that you've done in the Shinar Directive.
When you put both theories back into their historical view, all of the rabbis, all of the ante-Nicene fathers all believed in angel incursion. It wasn't until the 5th century that a Roman Catholic apologist came up with what is known as the Sethite theory. And it was because instead of using Genesis 6 to actually defend the gospel and defend these things, he was ill-equipped, that he had to formulate a theory that would diffuse what the pagans were saying, that Jesus was just simply another version of Tammuz. And it was hard for him to do that because the Catholic Church had already infused those things into their theology. So because he wasn't biblical, he had to create this other theory. But none of the early church fathers, there was no rabbi on record that ever had even hinted of the Sethite theory until the 5th century A.D.
Right, and so when you read the writings of the early church fathers, they talk about the giants as if this was just a commonly known fact, and that the giants arrived on earth as a result of fallen angels mating with humans and giving birth to these hybrids. I also read one time where the church around the 5th century was trying to become more science-based. They were trying to be more sophisticated. They wanted to get away essentially from the idea of miracles and angels and demons and all of that. So they hated this idea that angels had somehow commingled with women and gave birth to giants. So they're trying to be more sophisticated, right? It's that human level of knowledge that wants to strip the divinity from the original text.
And the only other thing that Julius Africanus left us was he said that Jesus was supposed to come back in the year 1000. So look at his track record.
Yeah. Well, there you go with making predictions about the second coming of Jesus Christ, right?
That's right.
But let's stay on this for a moment, because what happened in Genesis 6 is also connected to the character who is the central player in this book, Nimrod, right? The book of Genesis, you write about some things in here that's very interesting. Genesis 10, where it says some very peculiar things about Nimrod. Tell us about that.
You know, it's almost a footnote in history. It simply says that, Nimrod was born, he became to be a mighty hunter and lord, he began to be a mighty man, and it repeats it several times. And first of all, that word he began is halal in the original Hebrew. And in it, it can mean began, but it also means to corrupt, to defile, to prostitute. He did something that corrupted himself. And then it goes on to say that he became to be a Gibborim. When you look at the principle of first mention, back in Genesis 6, where it talks about the Nephilim, they begin to be mighty men of renown on the earth. That is the first time that Gibborim is used in the Word of God. So the very definition of a mighty man is a Nephilim. And so the second mention is with Nimrod. And it's not only that way in the Word of God, because, David's men were called Gibborim because they were able to do mighty exploits like the original Nephilim, the supernatural and the power of God. Even within Greek mythology, it carried that same thing. So Nimrod did something that corrupted himself. And even the rabbis knew the direction that really Moses was trying to hint here. The Septuagint literally says, and Nimrod became a giant. But I also found out that within that word halal, when you look at its various tenses, it also means to be run through or pierced through to the point of death. And we know that the Antichrist is going to be run through. He's going to have this mortal wound, but when he comes back, he's going to become something else. And then the third tense of that word actually is connected to the god Pan, because it's to play a flute. And so we see in Nimrod, he started out as a man. Something happened. He was able to do something that not even the Watchers could do. He started out fully human and transmorgified himself into becoming a Nephilim. And we're going to see the Antichrist is going to start out as a man, has a mortal wound in his head. They're going to use some transhumanist technique to bring him back, and when they do, Apollyon is going to inhabit perdition, and all of a sudden we see the full manifestation of the Antichrist. That's all encoded in that one word where he began to be a mighty man.
Now, you raised this word, Apollyon. The book of Revelation, the beast rises up out of the bottomless pit and goes into perdition, Apollyon, Apollia. The Apostle Paul uses that reference too when talking about the Antichrist. He says he'll be the son of perdition. That's the word Apollia, Apollyon. And we would want people to understand that Apollo is the Greek name of a mythological deity, a demigod. But if you follow that history backwards, essentially they're talking about this same mighty hunter, this same character that in the Bible is called Nimrod. The Sumerians refer to him as Gilgamesh. The Egyptians deified him as Osiris, the mighty hunter. But in the Bible, we find out that that spirit, whatever that is going to literally come up out of the bottomless pit and go into this man who's already on the earth. So what you just said was, he's what? He's on Earth. I mean, he's just got all the answers to all the political ailments of planet Earth. He's a genius. The world's in love with him. He's probably very charismatic. He's probably handsome. He's probably got degrees in science and tech, and he's all that in the Diet Coke too, as the young people say,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
But then something's going to happen to him, and what you're postulating is you think it's at that moment his deadly head wound is healed, and this is some kind of new genetic therapy. Is that something kind of like what happened with Nimrod? We don't really know, but what you're saying is that it's all implied in the text. He began to be. And the language halal, if I'm saying it correctly, can also imply something genetic.
Yes.
Now, when I've tried to kind of wrap my mind around how complex that line of thinking is, I've related it back to myself. I was born, and in my genetic makeup, I had the gene that can lead to diabetes, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you can have that genotype and not necessarily develop diabetes, but because I wasn't eating, people look at me and they think, oh, it's because he was overeating too much cake, right? And that wasn't the case. I was actually getting up in the morning and not eating at all until late into the afternoon because I'd get too busy, didn't want to stop and eat. And I'm throwing my blood sugar all over the place. And my doctor says he thinks that's what happened that then caused the genetic trigger. Mm-hmm. And all I can tell you is that now, by the way, I have this all under control now, but from that day forward, it started changing me in very powerful genetic ways. I wasn't a diabetic, but then I began to be. And that was how I kind of wrapped my mind around Nimrod, that perhaps there was some disposition in his genetic makeup, and given the occult knowledge that now is coming from Ham into this family, he starts making intentional efforts to defy God or something, and it sets his brain chemistry. I mean, I don't want to I don't want to try.
All that's there because he did something, and it says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That literally means in Hebrew, he got in God's face to do it. Once he became a Gibborim, he did it. Now, what we don't understand is the occult for centuries, they'll use meditation, diet, and many different practices. They believe that they've been able to turn on and off various DNA switches in our genetic code. But I actually believe that our DNA is more than what we are physically. I believe that our mental characteristics, our personality type, even our spirit is encoded into our DNA. Harvard University recently found out that there is an antenna array built on the outside of your DNA. Mm-hmm. And that's you're wired from your DNA on up to be able to pick up the voice of God.
Wow.
And so it's all encoded. So when he corrupted his flesh, he corrupted his mind and he corrupted his spirit. And he removed the image of God that was within him.
That brings so much kind of new meaning to phrases like when Jesus would say, my sheep know my voice, and a stranger they will not follow. They're tuned in. Their antenna is tuned in to pick up the signal, but you could turn the signal off. Very interesting. Let's stay on Nimrod here for a moment, because the other thing that I found to be intriguing is how, when Nimrod began to be a Gibborim, and you're right, in the Septuagint it literally is saying he started turning into a giant. He started becoming a genetic mutation. He immediately then starts doing something that you would only ascribe really to angelic knowledge, even if it's fallen angelic knowledge. After that, he immediately goes to a place and he starts the Shinar directive. He starts building a tower. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that now for a moment, because how would he know where to go and build a tower so that the top of it could penetrate Shemayim?
I think that the occult have known for years there are places on planet Earth, whether it's the 10 vortices I talk about in the book, that there are almost dimensional portals. Maybe there was a weak spot in that veil that separates the dimensional realities. But what fascinated me, I originally thought, okay, they have a valley, they're building a tower. Until I did this research, I didn't realize that city had a 400-foot wall around it that was big enough to have chariot races, that it was 200 miles square, and that he had 12 palaces. He was trying to rebuild Atlantis, and I believe when he was building that tower, it's not about height. It's about, there was a weak spot maybe in the dimensional veil there, and he was building a dimensional portal so that they could storm heaven. In his war against God, it was not just enough for him to draw all men to him instead of from God. He was going to use all those that he drew and corrupted in his battle against God in heaven.
Well, what your book also made me wonder is if he started changing, becoming a Gibborim, becoming what was a fallen, part of it, a fallen angelic mutation.
Yes.
A blend, a hybrid offspring that was so unlawful that God, who is described even in the Old Testament as not willing that any should perish, even made sure that Israel developed opportunity for non-Jews to come in and to become part of the family of God. This God who would go out of his way to do all of that, when it came to the Nephilim, there was absolutely no grace whatsoever. If you see a Nephilim, you kill it, and it cannot be redeemed. It cannot be saved. The Rapha, as they are described, in the Bible, they can't rise from the dead. They won't be part of the resurrection. Now, they might be able to take on some kind of materiality, but they're not going to take part in the second resurrection. So all this very strange kind of absolutism in this language about their damnation. Of course, the extra biblical book of Enoch goes into a lot of detail around that. They pled with God that their children, the fallen watchers pled with God that their Nephilim children could be redeemed, and no redemption's found for them.
But why? Going through back systematic theology, every once in a while I'll go through a good systematic theology just to make sure that Mike Lake's staying on track. And in R.T. Kendall's systematic theology, he made this statement. He said that within man there was the image of God. Although it was corrupt, it gave man his conscience. And so out of all creation, only man was created in the image of God. That's why he was able to have conscience. He was pricked to repentance and be able to be, man had the ability to be redeemed because he could repent. No angel has that ability. And so there was something about the Nephilim that when you became a Nephilim, it removed the image of God and maybe it replaced it with the image of the beast. And because of that, they were unredeemable because they would never be able to come to repentance.
You made me think, if he's changing genetically, if he's becoming Gibborim, if he's becoming part of the fallen offspring of the offspring of fallen angels, maybe he took on watcher propensities, which as angels would be able to see through those dimensional veils that you're talking about. And maybe that's why he went specifically into the land of the plains of Shinar to build that tower, because maybe he could see what you're calling that weakness in that veil. One other thing I want to say about this, in the first program we did, you briefly mentioned parallel realities, parallel universes, and as our understanding of quantum physics and theoretical physics advances and things, maybe we'll talk about CERN in a little while, things that are happening, we're starting to realize that there could be evidence now that we're picking up where something is resonating from a parallel reality that seems to affect our reality, and yet it's invisible to us, even if maybe it's literally occupying the same airspace, but our eyes don't pick up the frequency. We don't see it. We're not aware of it. Now, this sounds like angels and demons and God, and and probably really good reasons why our mind in this current condition can't see those realities. I'm not sure if we'd be able to, to be able to take what we would see. But the Tower of Babel, because what you talk about in the Shinar directive is what you said a moment ago. It wasn't just height. It wasn't just building a great big tower so he could get on top of it and shake his fist at God. This had something to do, kind of like a high level of angelic technological capacity was going on there that would allow some kind of resonation, something that would allow entering into that other reality.
Absolutely. And whether he was able to incorporate Watcher DNA into him, or simply the blending of species, because we know that animals can see things that we can't. That's why witches love to have cats, because they can see the spirits. It tells them when their familiars are there. And so whether he was able to blend animal DNA or Watcher DNA, but he knew that that valley was specifically strategic to what he wanted to do. And he knew that if he built the tower and completed it, that he would be able to access heaven. And even God said anything they put in their heart, they were able to do.
Right. Well, what did they imagine to do? To build a tower whose top would reach into the dwelling of God, Shamayim, and God says they will accomplish what they've set out to do. So he goes down, and you deal with all of that too, you know, why he confused the languages, what happened at Babel. But then, of course, the mystery religions, how they picked up some of these themes. Man, there's just so much here. Well, folks, we've got 6 minutes left in this. This is the second one, and I really thought we would take time to get into the meat of it. Maybe we're going to have to do another program. If you want to get a copy of the Shinar Directive, we are so just barely scratching the surface on this conversation right now. You can do that for $19.95. You should have a phone number there on your television screen that you could call if you prefer to do that. It also comes with a data DVD library. There's over 100 books that is in the data DVD library. There's 39 hours of seminars that Dr. Lake has hosted at different locations throughout the United States. There's Bible software for studying programs that's on the data DVD. In addition to that, we're giving you Mark A. Flynn's brand new book, The Forbidden Secrets of the Labyrinth. We're giving you Zenith 2016, which is, of course, my book. And a lot of people have said that this is probably my magnum opus, probably the best book I ever wrote. And then we're giving you a book that hasn't even been officially released yet, Terry James's brand new book, Antichrist Chronicles, Unveiling the Rise of the Earth's Final Führer. We picked these books and this data DVD library on purpose because they so complement the work that you've done in this book, the Shinar Directive. And when you put them all together and study them back to back, you probably get the most complete picture of this ancient conspiracy that was born really in the plains of Shinar and gave birth to the Babylonian mystery religions, which we haven't even talked about, but the role that of course then also plays in modern day occultism and the belief by some of the most powerful occultists on earth. We're talking the 33rd degree level and higher among the Masonic, among the Rosicrucians, and other occultists who believe and are dedicated to seeing the return of the golden age, as it is prophesied on the Great Seal of the United States. "'Tis thine own Apollo reigns," the Kume Sibyl said. The return of Apollo, the return of Nimrod, is on the Great Seal of the United States of America. But it was born back there when this rascal started building the Tower of Babel to defy God himself. Now, here's a question that I could imagine people watching this program today wondering, well, is it biblical to even think that there are strategic locations on the earth where that one place might be a place where angels, both fallen and unfallen, can ascend and descend? And yet that is a biblical premise, isn't it?
Jacob found one. We call it Jacob's ladder, that when he fell asleep there, he had a dream that there was a dimensional portal there, that angels were ascending and descending, and it so moved him that he built an altar in that place. And so it's very biblical, and in fact, there's other ones that kind of escapes my mind right now where they are, but there are many of them that we see that there are certain places where God comes to visit. In fact, some places he puts his signature. When you enter into a Jewish home, there's a mezuzah that has a sheen on it. When you look at the mountain range in Jerusalem, there's literally a sheen written in the mountain range of Jerusalem. So God is saying, this place there is a portal that I will come and visit with you at.
Right. And of course, the Watchers came down on Mount Hermon, and that's to this day known as a forbidden place. The very language around it implies that it was a specific location that these angels descended down out of heaven onto that mountain. And for a long time, the Greeks You mentioned Pan earlier in his flute. The Greeks had dedicatories there, where the demon god Pan would be worshipped. And yet when Jesus was in Caesarea Philippi, he was right there with an eyesight range of those little temples carved into the mountain face there to Pan. And that's where he said to his disciples, the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. And part of what you're doing with this work is building a cause to wake up the remnant, to make them know that there might be gateways all over the earth. In fact, we're probably going to have you come back. We're going to run out of time. We probably ought to pick this up and do another show if you're willing to. But you're wanting them to understand what Jesus meant when he said the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. We've got about 1 minute left. How do you want to close this show? What do you want to tell us?
Although the devil's getting ready to open up portals, so is heaven. Our greatest hour is upon us if we just press into God. I think God is going to awaken things in us that we never dreamed possible. It's time for the church to become that church without spot and a wrinkle and give the devil hell before we get out of here.
Well, I think that's something that we could all say amen to. Once again, get your copy of the Shinar Directive so that you can read the fascinating research, actually, that you've done in this book. You know, I'm a student of the Word and a student of history, and I learned all kinds of things in this book that I didn't know, and until now I thought that I had actually written one of the books on the subject matter, and now it needs to be edited and improved, or as we're doing here, simply give it away with your work as well. Well, Dr. Lake, it's been wonderful talking to you for these first 2 shows. We're going to do a third one. And what do you want to talk about when we come back in this next program?
I think connecting the dots of the time that we're in and then the awakening of the remnant.
All right. Well, folks, thank you for joining us. And again, remember, keep watching Skywatch Television. Why are we Sky Watchers? Because we believe in the imminent coming of Jesus Christ, and we want you to be ready to meet him too.